Last week, newly elected Legalised Cannabis Victoria members of the Legislative Council, David Edershank and Rachel Payne, introduced a bill to allow medicinal cannabis patients to drive with detectable levels of THC in the system, provided that it is safe for them to do so. Now, the Road Safety Amendment, Medicinal Cannabis Bill 2023, proposes just a modest change to the Road Safety Act to no longer make it an offence for a driver who is unimpaired to have detectable THC in the system, provided that they have a medical cannabis prescription and that they have taken their medication in accordance with that prescription. Join us to discuss the bill is David Edershank, MLC, member of the Legalised Cannabis Victoria Party. Welcome, David.
G'day, Michael. Nice to see you.
Likewise. Now, the exemption does not apply to the driver of a motor vehicle who is impaired or, as we used to say, stoned or incapable of having proper motor vehicle control.
That's correct. So that's correct, Michael. Look, if you're impaired, whatever the drug, whether it's alcohol or benzodiazepines or opiates or whatever, or cannabis, if you're impaired, you shouldn't be on the road. And this bill that we've proposed to the House makes that very clear. It's about people who've got the capacity to drive safely and who are using a prescribed medicinal cannabis.
Yeah, and just to be clear, there are more and more people being prescribed medicinal cannabis for a range of different impairments, such as back pain, knee pain, hip pain, all of these things. And it seems to be a leftover bit from when we legalised it and we didn't take into consideration, gee, here are some of the unintended consequences of having that inability to drive with THC in your system.
Exactly right. It's and I think the Premier's recognised this publicly. He's stated this. It's a leftover business from when the Labor government in 2016 introduced medicinal cannabis into Victoria. It was the first state to do it. And yes, it's this legacy issue that just needs to be cleaned up and resolved for the sake of somewhere around 75,000 Victorians who are currently prescribed medicinal cannabis.
Now, the bill's scheduled to be debated next week. How do you think it'll go? You seem to indicated that the Premier has a understanding of what you're actually doing without some of the hysteria that some of the naysayers are throwing up in the media.
Yeah, look, I mean, we're really encouraged by the Premier's comments. Clearly he's got a good grasp on this issue. I think he recognises that it's an anomaly that if you take any other medically prescribed drug in Victoria, if you're unimpaired, you can drive, except for one, and that's medicinal cannabis. So the Premier recognises this. The government recognises this, so we're looking forward to further discussions with the government over the period to next week when the bill will be introduced, and we'll see what happens then.
Great. Now, David, newly minted MLC, how's it going since you've been in?
A little bit of head spinning. There's a very big learning curve. That said, this is an extraordinary privilege to be in this position. And there's a lot of really great people in and around the Parliament to sort of help us sort of come to grips with what needs to be done. So, yeah, big learning curve. I won't say it's fun yet, but it's certainly very educational. And we're getting an opportunity to put forward the sort of messages that people voted for us to put forward.
Yeah, it's great to have that mandate. Did really well as somebody who also ran as independent. It's become such a integral point. As you said, all of these other drugs are okay, but we've just got this leftover, how do we say it, bias that, oh no, it's an illegal drug, but it's a drug no different to any of the other drugs. The opiates cause a lot of problems, and this could well be a better option for a lot of people who are on opiates, especially it seems to have found its place in pain management.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the biggest, well, it's very hard to get good data, okay, and that's part of the whole prohibition regime that currently exists. But if you look at it, I mean, a lot of people who use medicinal cannabis actually have it for insomnia and sleep related. And we know that the period of impaction for most cannabis is 4 to 8 hours. Most people are pretty much straight after 4 hours. Unfortunately, THC remains in their blood for a week in the case of like oral swabs, or a month in the case of blood. So, if you're one of those insomniacs or people who are dealing with pain to sleep, and I personally had that problem not so long ago, then even though you might wake up completely fresh as a daisy and as straight as a die, if you get pulled up at a random drug test, say goodbye to your license.
Yeah.
So that's sort of why we're just saying, look, this is just crazy. Let's just normalize this. If you're saying it's acceptable for a doctor to prescribe it, then police it in the same way that you would any other prescribed medication. It's really simple.
All right. Now, David, the next point of contention for your party and for Victoria would have to be the decriminalisation of cannabis. Where do you sit on that? How long do you think will be before we make a move on that?
I guess there's 2 points to make. I guess one, we've got a bill before the House covering the medicinal cannabis issue, and we're keen to get that sorted first, because that's an easy fix and demonstrates a whole lot of bona fides around how we move forward. In terms of the broader issue, I guess there's this whole debate about decriminalise versus legalise versus other things, and I guess what we're about, Michael, is really talking about regulation. We've got in Victoria something like 1 million people over the age of 15 who've consumed cannabis in the last 12 months. So we're not talking about like a fringe group here. We're talking about a major part of the community, and we're talking about a huge market. So we are keen to sit down with the government, sit down with the opposition, sit down with anyone in the parliament and say, all right, look, how do we regulate this market? We need to address supply. We need to address demand. We need to come up with a comprehensive approach that everyone's comfortable with, and catch up with the rest of the world. Because there's clearly this has been introduced in more than half the US populations in legalized setting. Canada, Europe, in most of Europe's now either has moved or is in the process of moving. So it's sort of let's just catch up. But there needs to be a good considered approach to how that happens. And so we'll be working, I think, with the government and with the other parties over the balance of the year to try and work out what does that look like and how do we make that change in a way that includes appropriate public health measures, harm minimisation measures, those sort of things that will make this a sort of normalisation process.
Yeah, the sky hasn't fallen in all of those jurisdictions that you've mentioned. A lot of the, again, naysayers and, the world was going to collapse should this happen, and we were heading for the ruination. Hasn't actually happened, but we can also fix it as we go along. It's not a one go at it. It's either right or it's wrong. It's, well, this is right and we didn't see this. We can fix that and address that. Prohibition's never worked on anything, has it, David?
No, I mean, look, we've had prohibition in Victoria now for 95 years, and we've got 1 million people consuming cannabis. Like, what's wrong with this picture? And you're right, the sky hasn't fallen, the world hasn't ended. That's not to say that there aren't lessons from abroad about what not to do, just as there are places in the world where you can go, wow, they've had a really good approach. So it's a case of taking the stakeholders through the process of looking at the different approaches and finding a sensible road through that's going to be in the best interest of the community as a whole. And let's also, at the same time, reverse the criminality element of this issue. Because the way the law works now is that the day-to-day consumers like myself and perhaps you, Michael, we commit a criminal act every time we consume cannabis unless it's prescription. At the same time, because of this antiquated law, you create this huge criminal market, which I think the ACIC says is worth about $8 billion a year. Now, there's just no logic in that. So it's a case then of sitting down and working through this in a logical way to find a good model for the normalisation of cannabis and regulating it appropriately.
Yeah, and that's the thing, David. Consumers of the cannabis are forced to come into contact with the criminal element, who very rarely are just doing the cannabis. They're a one-stop shop for a lot of things, but we also have the ability, when it's regulated and taxed, to then contribute some of that to treatment programs for those that do have problems with it. Whereas now that's all coming out of our public health funds for the treatment.
And it's sort of like, going back to the sort of the Nancy Reagan sort of just say no kids, I mean, I can't remember whether that was sex or drugs or both, but, it's going to have that same effect. If you just prohibit, you can't govern. All that does is deny. And if you're just in denial and you've got 1 million Victorians consuming on an annual basis, it might not be working. Yeah. And you are effectively excluding yourself from an intelligent conversation with the population.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there. So David Essexshank, member of the Legislative Council. Must take you a long time to sign that name now, David, but congratulations on your party and good luck with your advocacy for moving things forward in a way that it seems inevitable. So let's get it done and get it done right.
Thank you for your time, Michael. Lovely to speak with you.